In the chill of late October, a group of 5 friends stood at the edge of a dense forest, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The old tales of the abandoned Soviet bunker had always been the stuff of legend in their small town. Whispers of strange creatures, secret experiments, and the eerie disappearances of the few brave, or foolish, people who had ventured inside circulated for decades. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed it housed a far worse secret, something that had been created, not born. For Andre, the leader of the group, the bunker was a mystery he had to solve. His fascination with the place had been building since childhood. Every crumbling wall and rusted gate of the long-forgotten military installation called to him. He'd spent years researching it, poring over faded government documents, talking to elderly locals who remembered rumors from the era. He was convinced that something was hidden deep within, something that hadn't been uncovered in all these years. So, when the chance to explore the bunker finally arose, Andre convinced his friends, Nina, Pavel, Ivan, and Katya, to join him. They had always been up for an adventure, but none of them could have known the darkness they were about to uncover. The descent into the bunker. The path leading to the bunker was overgrown with weeds and thick underbrush. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. As the group neared the entrance, an oppressive silence settled over them. Even the birds, who had been chirping relentlessly, fell silent as if in respect or fear. The bunker loomed ahead, its metal door partially ajar, revealing a pitch-black abyss beyond. The once strong structure had deteriorated over the years, with cracks running along its concrete exterior, vines clinging to the surface as if trying to pull the bunker back into the earth. A faded Soviet star still adorned the front, barely visible in the dim light. "Are you sure about this, Andre?" Katya asked, her voice trembling slightly. She was the most cautious of the group, always the one to second-guess their decisions. Andre nodded, though the knot in his stomach told him otherwise. "We'll be fine. It's just an old bunker. What's the worst that could happen?" Pavel snorted. Famous last words. With a nervous laugh, the group stepped inside, one by one. The air inside the bunker was cold and musty, the kind of dampness that clung to your skin. Their flashlights flickered as they moved deeper into the structure. The walls were lined with peeling posters of Soviet propaganda. The red and gold of the hammer and sickle faded almost beyond recognition. Rusted machinery and broken equipment littered the floor. As they descended a metal staircase into the lower levels, the sense of unease grew stronger. It felt as though the bunker itself was alive, breathing, waiting for something. But none of them could pinpoint what. Nina was the first to hear it, the faint sound of something moving in the shadows. She stopped, her hand clutching Ivan's arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Ivan shook his head, though his expression was tense. Probably just rats. But they all knew it was more than that. The first encounter. They continued deeper, the corridors twisting and turning, as if designed to confuse and disorient anyone who dared venture inside. Andre kept track of their route, marking their path with chalk on the walls. But the deeper they went, the more the marks seemed to fade, as if the walls were swallowing them. Eventually, they reached a large steel door at the end of a long hallway. It was different from the others, reinforced, with strange symbols etched into the surface. Andre had never seen anything like it in his research. "What do you think's in there?" Pavel asked, his voice a mix of excitement and fear. Andre didn't answer. He approached the door, running his fingers over the symbols. They were rough to the touch, almost like claw marks. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was massive, far larger than they had expected. It looked like some sort of laboratory, with rows of shattered glass containers and broken equipment scattered across the floor. There was something else, though, something that made their skin crawl. Large, dark stains covered the floor and walls, and the smell of decay was overpowering. "What the hell happened here?" Katya muttered, her eyes wide with horror. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the room, sending a shiver down their spines. They froze, turning their flashlights toward the source of the sound. From the shadows emerged a creature unlike anything they had ever seen. Its skin was pale and slick, almost translucent, and its body was twisted and deformed. It moved on all fours, but its limbs were too long, its movements unnaturally fast. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were nothing more than hollow sockets, and its mouth was filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The creature lunged. Panic erupted as the group scattered, their flashlights flickering wildly as they ran for their lives. Ivan was the first to fall, the creature's claws sinking into his back as he screamed in agony. Blood sprayed across the walls as it dragged him into the shadows. Andrei yelled for the others to run, his heart pounding in his chest as he grabbed Kadia's arm and pulled her toward the door. But the creature was fast, too fast. It tore through the group like a force of nature, its claws slicing through flesh with sickening ease. By the time they made it out of the room, only Andrei and Kadia remained. Nina and Pavel had been taken, dragged into the darkness, their screams echoing through the corridors until they were abruptly cut off. Trapped, Andrei and Kadia ran blindly through the maze-like bunker, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sounds of the creature's pursuit echoed behind them, growing louder with every passing second. "We have to get out of here," Kadia cried, her voice trembling with fear. "I'm trying," Andrei shouted back, his mind racing. He knew they were lost. The bunker was a labyrinth, and with every twist and turn, he felt more disoriented. The chalk marks he had left behind were nowhere to be found. Then, as they turned a corner, they saw it, a small side room, its door slightly ajar. Without thinking, Andrei pulled Kadia inside and slammed the door shut behind them. The room was small and cramped, filled with old filing cabinets and dusty papers. It looked like an office of some sort, long abandoned. The walls were lined with shelves, and in the corner was a small, rusted vent leading into the ventilation system. Andrei pressed his ear to the door, listening for any sign of the creature. For a few moments, there was only silence. Then, the sound of something scraping against the metal walls sent chills down his spine. It was close, too close. Kadia was trembling, her eyes wide with fear. What are we going to do? Andrei didn't know. He had no plan, no idea how to escape. All he knew was that they couldn't stay there. The creature would find them eventually. "We need to move," he whispered. "We'll go through the vent. Maybe it leads outside." Kadia hesitated, but nodded. They had no other choice. Into the darkness. The vent was narrow, barely large enough for them to crawl through. It was dark and filthy, the air thick with dust and the stench of decay. As they moved deeper into the ventilation system, the sound of the creature grew fainter, but the oppressive silence that followed was almost worse. The further they crawled, the more disoriented they became. The vent seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Every now and then, Andrei would hear a strange sound, like something crawling in the darkness just beyond his reach. Eventually, they reached a fork in the vent. One path led downward, into the lower levels of the bunker. The other led upward, toward the surface. "Which way?" Kadia whispered. Andrei hesitated. Something about the downward path felt wrong, like it was leading them deeper into the heart of the bunker, into something far worse than the creature they had encountered. But the upward path didn't feel much better. "We go up," he decided. They crawled for what felt like hours, the air growing colder and thinner. Every now and then, they would hear the faint sound of something moving in the distance, but they never saw anything. It was as if the bunker itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the vent. A rusted grate blocked their exit, but with a few hard kicks, Andrei was able to dislodge it. They crawled out into a small room, similar to the one they had hidden in earlier. But this room was different. The walls were lined with strange symbols, similar to the ones they had seen on the door of the laboratory. In the center of the room was a large metal door, sealed shut with a complex locking mechanism, and beside it, a control panel with a single, glowing button. "What is this place?" Kadia whispered, her voice trembling. Andrei didn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of information he had gathered over the years. The symbols, the experiments, the creatures, it all pointed to something far more sinister than he had ever imagined. Before he could say anything, The door slamming shut behind them echoed ominously through the small room, causing both Andre and Katia to jump. They were now trapped, with no way back and only the strange metal door in front of them. Panic gripped Andre for a moment, but he forced himself to focus. "Katia, stay calm," he said, though his own voice trembled. His eyes darted to the control panel, its single glowing button casting an eerie red light across the room. It was their only option. What if pressing it makes things worse? Katia whispered, her breath quickening. She was on the verge of breaking down. Andre bit his lip, staring at the panel. "We don't have a choice." Taking a deep breath, he pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air was filled with the loud grinding of ancient machinery stirring to life. The locking mechanism on the door clicked and hissed, releasing steam. The door began to slowly swing open, revealing a dark chamber beyond. Cold air rushed out, bringing with it the smell of chemicals and decay. Katia grabbed Andre's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Do we really want to go in there?" "We don't have any other option," Andre replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "That creature is still out there. This might be our way out." He stepped forward, flashlight in hand, and shined it into the chamber. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. The Chamber of Horrors. The room beyond the door was massive, far larger than any they had encountered so far. It stretched out in all directions, the walls lined with strange machines and glass containers, much like the ones they had seen in the laboratory. But these containers weren't broken. Inside, floating in some kind of thick, murky liquid, were twisted forms. Some were human, or at least had once been. Others were far more grotesque, with extra limbs, misshapen faces, and skin that seemed to melt off their bodies. The dim light from their flashlights illuminated the horrific display, casting shadows that seemed to writhe and shift as if the creatures inside were still alive. "Oh my God," Katia whispered, covering her mouth in horror. Andre's stomach churned, but he forced himself to keep moving. It's some kind of experiment. This is what they were doing here. They were creating these things." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The Soviet bunker wasn't just a military installation. It had been a laboratory, a testing ground for grotesque experiments. The creatures they had encountered were not born in the wild. They were made, twisted and deformed by whatever the scientists here had been working on. They were trying to create something, Andre muttered, almost to himself, something powerful. But they lost control. Katia's voice was barely audible. "Do you think those things are still alive?" Andre shined his flashlight on one of the larger containers. Inside, a massive creature with bloated, pale skin floated, its body riddled with scars and stitches. Its eyes were closed, its chest still. "I don't think so," he said. "At least not yet." But before he could say anything more, a loud crash echoed from behind them. The creature that had been stalking them in the tunnels was close, far too close for comfort. "Move," Andre hissed, pulling Katia forward. They had to find another exit, something that would lead them out of this nightmare. The descent into madness. They ran across the chamber, dodging between the rows of containers and equipment, their flashlights dancing across the grotesque forms trapped in the glass. Every few seconds, Andre would glance behind them, expecting to see the pale, twisted creature lunging out of the shadows. But for now, they were alone, or so it seemed. At the far end of the chamber, they found another door. Unlike the previous ones, this one was not reinforced. It was an old wooden door, cracked and worn, as if it had been there for decades, forgotten by time. "Here," Andre shouted, pulling it open. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, leading downward into the unknown. Katia hesitated. "We're going deeper?" Andre didn't have time to think. "We have no choice." They descended the stairs as quickly as they could, their footsteps echoing through the narrow passageway. The air grew colder the further down they went, and soon the walls were slick with moisture. The stairway seemed to stretch on forever, winding downward into the depths of the bunker, deeper than Andre had ever imagined. Finally, they reached the bottom, emerging into a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls here were different, no longer the cold, sterile concrete of the upper levels. These walls were made of rough stone, as if they had been carved out of the earth itself. The ceiling dripped with water, and the floor was uneven and covered in puddles. "What is this place?" Katia whispered, her voice echoing eerily in the corridor. Andre shook his head. "I don't know. This wasn't part of the original bunker. It must be older, something beneath the bunker." As they moved further down the corridor, the faint sound of whispers reached their ears. At first, Andre thought it was just the wind, but the voices grew louder, more distinct. They were speaking in Russian, but the words were garbled, nonsensical, as if spoken by someone who had forgotten how to form proper sentences. "Do you hear that?" Katia asked, her face pale. Andre nodded. "We need to keep moving." The whispers followed them as they continued down the corridor, growing louder with each step. The air felt heavier here, thick with an unnatural energy. It was as if the very ground beneath them was alive, pulsing with some unseen force. Finally, they reached another door. This one was made of iron, rusted and ancient, with strange symbols etched into its surface, symbols that Andre recognized from his research. They were the same ones that had been on the door to the laboratory. Without thinking, Andre pushed the door open. The heart of the bunker. The room beyond the door was unlike anything they had seen before. It was a large, circular chamber, with walls made of smooth black stone. In the center of the room was a massive, pulsing machine, its surface covered in strange tubes and wires that snaked across the floor like vines. The machine hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration, filling the room with an oppressive energy. Around the machine were more of the glass containers, but these were different. They were larger, and inside each one was a creature far more grotesque than anything they had seen before. Some had multiple heads, others had limbs that twisted in impossible ways, and all of them were clearly still alive, their bodies twitching and writhing in the murky liquid. Andre stared in horror. "What is this place?" This is where they did it," Katia whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is where they created them." The machine in the center of the room seemed to pulse in time with their heartbeats, as if it were alive, watching them. Andre felt a chill run down his spine. There was something wrong about this place, something deeply unnatural. "We need to leave," Katia said, backing toward the door. "Now." But before they could move, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang. Andre spun around, his heart pounding. "No, no, no, no." He rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. Suddenly, the machine in the center of the room began to hum louder, its vibrations growing more intense. The creatures in the containers twitched violently, their eyes snapping open, glowing with an unnatural light. "What's happening?" Katia cried, her voice rising in panic. The machine's hum grew into a deafening roar, and the containers began to crack, the glass shattering as the creatures inside thrashed violently. One by one, the monstrosities broke free, their twisted, deformed bodies spilling out onto the floor. "Andre!" Katia screamed, grabbing his arm. "We need to do something." Andre's mind raced. He knew they didn't stand a chance against the creatures. There were too many, and they were too powerful. But there had to be a way out, something he could do. His eyes darted to the control panel on the machine. It was covered in buttons and switches, all labeled in faded Russian. One of the buttons was large and red, just like the one they had seen earlier. "That has to be it," Andre muttered. "It must shut down the machine." Without another word, he sprinted toward the control panel, dodging the flailing limbs of the creatures as they surged toward him. Katia screamed for him to stop, but he ignored her, his focus entirely on the button. Just as one of the creatures lunged at him, he slammed his hand down on the button. The effect was immediate. The machine let out a high-pitched whine, and the creatures froze in place, their bodies twitching violently. Then, one by one, they collapsed to the floor, their lifeless forms crumpling into heaps of twisted flesh. The room fell silent. Escape. Andre collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. His body ached from the tension, and his mind was spinning. But they were alive. Somehow, they had survived. Katia rushed to Andre's side, her face pale with fear, but her eyes filled with relief. "You're alive!" she gasped, kneeling beside him, her hands trembling as she grabbed his arm. I thought you were." Andre, still struggling to catch his breath, nodded weakly. "I'm fine. We need to get out of here now." The machine in the center of the room had fallen silent, its eerie hum now just a distant memory. The monstrous creatures, once grotesquely alive, lay still on the cold stone floor, their twisted forms leaking some kind of dark fluid. For a moment, the bunker was quiet, the air heavy with the aftermath of the chaos. But Andre knew it wasn't over. Something deeper, something more dangerous, was still lurking in the shadows. He forced himself to his feet, shaking off the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him. There has to be another way out. That door. He gestured to the iron door that had trapped them inside. It locked from the outside. Maybe there's another exit somewhere in this room. Katia nodded, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. She was barely holding on, but Andre admired her strength. After everything they had seen, after everything that had happened, she hadn't broken. Not yet. They began to search the chamber, moving cautiously around the piles of lifeless creatures. The walls were smooth and unmarked, offering no signs of hidden doors or escape routes. Andre's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room as it swept over the strange machinery that dominated the space. Then, he noticed something. A faint glimmer of light, reflecting off a section of the wall behind the massive central machine. "Katia, over here," he called, moving toward it. Together, they pushed aside a tangle of cables and metal debris, revealing a small, barely visible hatch set into the floor. It was covered in dust and grime, as if it hadn't been used in decades. Andre knelt beside it, wiping away the dirt with his sleeve. There was no handle, but a small panel with more faded Russian writing was embedded beside it. "Help me open this," Andre said, pressing his hands against the edges of the hatch. Katia joined him, and together they strained to lift the heavy metal door. For a moment, it didn't budge, and panic began to set in. But then, with a loud creak, it gave way, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. A metal ladder was bolted to the side of the shaft, leading down into the unknown. Andre hesitated, peering into the abyss. "I don't know where this leads, but it's our only option." Katia swallowed hard, her face pale. "We've come this far. We can't stop now." Andre nodded. He had no idea if they were escaping one nightmare just to enter another, but they couldn't stay here. Not with the knowledge that whatever had created those monsters might still be active. He went first, gripping the cold rungs of the ladder as he descended into the darkness. The shaft was narrow, the air damp and oppressive. His flashlight flickered, casting weak light ahead, but the bottom of the shaft remained out of sight. After what felt like an eternity, his feet finally touched solid ground. "Come down," he called up to Katia, who was waiting nervously above. She hesitated for a moment, but then began her descent. The metal groaned under her weight, and for a terrifying second, Andre thought the ladder might give way. But Katia reached the bottom safely. They stood in another corridor, but this one was different from the others they had seen in the bunker. The walls were smoother, more modern, as if this section of the facility had been built long after the initial construction. Dim emergency lights lined the ceiling, casting a faint glow over the corridor. There was no sign of the creatures or the experiments that had plagued them before. "It looks newer," Katia whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the narrow space. "Do you think this was a secret part of the bunker?" "Maybe," Andre muttered, moving cautiously forward. "Or maybe this is where they tried to contain whatever they created." The corridor stretched out before them, straight and seemingly endless. As they walked, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the eerie silence. Andre kept his flashlight trained ahead, his nerves on edge, ready for anything. After several minutes, they reached another door, this one far more advanced than the others. It was made of heavy steel, with a keypad beside it and more Russian instructions written across its surface. Andre stared at the keypad, trying to make sense of the instructions. His Russian was good, but the technical language used here was confusing. "It's some kind of lockdown door," he said finally. "It needs a code to open." "Do you know the code?" Katia asked, her voice tight with tension. Andre shook his head, frustration boiling up inside him. He had come so far, survived so much, only to be stopped by a security system he had no way of cracking. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from behind them. Both Andre and Katia whipped around, hearts pounding. The sound repeated, growing louder, closer. Something was coming down the corridor.
No,
Katia whispered, backing away from the door. Not again. Andre's mind raced. He frantically searched the keypad, his eyes scanning for something, anything that could help. Then he saw it, a small, faded note tucked into the corner of the control panel. It was barely legible, written in hurried, messy handwriting. The note read, "Final protocol, enter code 1986 to override." Without wasting a second, Andre punched the numbers into the keypad. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud hiss, the door began to slide open. "Go!" Andre shouted, grabbing Katia's arm and pulling her through the doorway just as a monstrous figure appeared at the far end of the corridor. They slammed the door shut behind them, the creature's enraged roar muffled by the thick steel. Andre fell to his knees, gasping for air, his entire body shaking from the adrenaline and fear. Katia leaned against the wall, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're alive." But Andre wasn't so sure. He slowly stood, scanning their new surroundings. They were in another room, this one stark and clinical, filled with old computer terminals and equipment. The hum of a nearby generator filled the air, the first sound of modern machinery they had heard in what felt like hours. At the far end of the room was a large, reinforced door, the kind used in military bunkers. Andre's heart raced. This had to be it. The way out. "We're almost there," he said, grabbing Katia's hand and pulling her toward the door. But just as they reached it, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the bunker, and the lights flickered. Andre froze, his hand hovering over the door's handle. "What's happening?" Katia asked, her voice filled with dread. The trembling grew stronger, and from behind them came the unmistakable sound of something huge moving through the corridors. It was the creature, the one they had barely escaped, and it wasn't alone. "We don't have time," Andre said, yanking the door open. Behind it was a long tunnel, leading upward. Fresh air wafted through, carrying with it the scent of the forest. Freedom. They sprinted into the tunnel, their hearts pounding, the sound of the creatures growing louder behind them. The tunnel was long, but the faint light at the end was enough to give them hope. They were so close to escaping this nightmare. But just as they neared the exit, the ground shook violently, and part of the tunnel collapsed behind them, blocking the creature's path but also trapping them inside. They burst through the tunnel's opening and into the cold night air. The sky above them was clear, the stars twinkling overhead. They had made it. They were outside. Andre collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Katia fell beside him, her eyes wide as she stared up at the sky. "We're out," she whispered. "We're out." For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just lay there, staring up at the stars, feeling the cool breeze against their skin. The nightmare was over. The aftermath. Several days later, Andre sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the old documents spread out on the table before him. The research he had gathered about the bunker now felt like a distant memory, a part of his life that no longer seemed real. Katia had left the town, unable to cope with the horrors they had faced. He didn't blame her. He had considered leaving too, but something kept him here, something he couldn't explain. The creatures, the experiments, the bunker. It was all part of a larger secret, something the government had tried to bury. Andre had barely scratched the surface of it. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was an email sent from an anonymous address. The subject line read, "You weren't supposed to survive." His blood ran cold. Andre hesitated, then opened the email. Inside was a single sentence, "There are others, and they know you're alive." His heart pounded in his chest. He stared at the screen, fear creeping up his spine.